They say if you see a stranger standing by the side of the road at night, never stop your car. Because once you do, you might never be the one driving again. If this were you, what would you do? Before I go into the full story, subscribe now to hear my stories again, and that's if you genuinely like what I do here. Turn on post notification too if you want to get notified when I send a gift your way. Also, tell me where you're watching from and what time is it there. Now turn on the fan to have that soothing background hum while you listen. Story 1. If you ever see a pale young woman standing alone on Archer Avenue, don't slow down. I did once, and I swear to you, she climbed into my car without opening the door. It was late one Saturday night in Chicago, the kind of night where the city feels both alive and strangely empty. The streets were slick from a light drizzle, reflecting the glow of the street lamps like broken mirrors. I had been driving back from a friend's wedding, my tie undone, the faint buzz of alcohol still in my head, though I was sober enough to drive. The heater hummed softly, the rhythm of the tires against the road steady, almost hypnotic. Archer Avenue was familiar to me. Quiet, long, lined with stretches of woods and the occasional old building. It was the kind of road where your thoughts wander, and your eyelids feel heavy. Nothing unusual, nothing frightening. At least not yet. I noticed her near the cemetery gates. A woman in a white dress, walking slowly as if she had nowhere to go but was in no rush to get there. At first, I thought she was just someone leaving a party nearby. Her dress shimmered faintly in the headlights, old-fashioned, almost out of place for the year. She didn't wave, didn't look distressed. She just stood there as though waiting. My first thought was how cold she must be, standing there with no coat in the damp air. Against my better judgment, I slowed down. Something about her felt strange, but also sad. I rolled down the passenger window a crack and asked if she needed a ride. She didn't speak, but she nodded just once. When she opened the door, it made no sound. I remember that clearly because my car was old, and the hinges usually squeaked. She slid into the seat with the grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times. She kept her gaze forward, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Her hair was damp from the drizzle, sticking to her pale skin, but her dress remained spotless. I tried to make small talk, asked where she was headed. She answered quietly, almost a whisper, "Just down the road." Something about her voice unsettled me. It wasn't the tone, it was how final it sounded. Like she knew exactly where she was going, and it wasn't anywhere I could follow. We drove in silence. Every time I glanced at her, she seemed more fragile, like she might crumble into dust if I touched her. The strangest part? She didn't look at me once, not even when I spoke directly to her. We passed the cemetery, and she shifted suddenly, almost flinching. Her hands tightened together, and for the first time, she turned toward me. Her eyes were dark, bottomless, and they carried a weight I can't explain. Just as I was about to ask if she was okay, she leaned closer and said, "Stop here." Her finger pointed toward the cemetery gates. My stomach tightened. I knew the stretch of road, and there was no house, no bar, no diner nearby, just the graves. Against my own logic, I pulled over. The car idled softly, headlights casting pale light on the iron gates. I turned to her, ready to ask if she really wanted me to leave her there. But the passenger seat was empty. No door had opened. No sound had been made. She was gone. I slammed the brakes, heart racing, and twisted around, scanning the back seat. Nothing. The only sound was my own breathing. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, her reflection. Not in the mirror, but in the glass of the passenger window. She was still sitting there, staring straight ahead, hands folded neatly in her lap. But when I turned fully, the seat was empty. I pressed the gas, desperate to get away, the cemetery fading in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back again. When I finally got home, I sat in my car for nearly an hour, staring at the empty seat, waiting for it to creak, waiting for something to shift. But nothing happened. I told myself it was exhaustion, the late night, the drinks at the wedding. But deep down, I knew better. I had given a ride to someone who never left that road. To this day, I don't drive down Archer Avenue after dark. And when I hear stories about Resurrection Mary, I don't laugh. I don't call it a myth. I just keep quiet, because I know what I saw. Or worse, I know who sat in my car. Would you have stopped for her? Or would you have kept driving, even if she looked stranded and helpless? Tell me in the comments if you think Mary was just a story, or if she's still waiting by those gates tonight. Story 2. If you ever hear knocking on your walls at night, don't answer back. Because once you acknowledge it, the knocking never stops. I grew up in Adams, Tennessee, in a house that still stands on the edge of a stretch of farmland. Back then, it was just home to me. An old wooden place where the floorboards creaked and the wind whistled through the cracks. My family didn't talk much about history, but every now and then I'd hear neighbors mutter about the land, about curses, about something they called the Bell Witch. I thought it was just one of those small-town stories people tell to keep kids from wandering into the woods. But I know now there was truth in it. One autumn evening, I was sitting in my room with a book, the kind of quiet night that made the whole world feel settled. My window was cracked open, letting in the sound of crickets and the faint rustle of trees. My mother was downstairs cooking, the smell of onions and fried meat drifting up, and my younger brother was humming a tune while playing with his toy soldiers on the floor. It was ordinary, comforting, nothing that would make you think of ghosts or witches. The first sound came just as I turned off the light to settle into bed. A knock, 3 times, steady, sharp, against the wall beside my head. I thought it was my brother playing a trick, so I pounded back with my fist and told him to quit it. Silence followed, then laughter. But it wasn't his laughter. It was a low, scratchy sound, like someone struggling to breathe while chuckling. I froze, staring at the wall, waiting for it to happen again. It didn't stop with the knocking. Soon it was whispers. I'd be drifting off and hear my name, faint, almost swallowed by the air, right by my ear. Sometimes it was a woman's voice, sometimes it was deeper, as though 2 voices overlapped. When I told my father, he looked at me the way you'd look at someone who already knew better. He just said, "Don't answer it. Don't ever answer it." That made it worse, because it meant he believed me. Weeks passed, and the disturbances grew. Objects shifted when no one was around. My shoes ended up on the porch roof. My brother's toys scattered across the yard, even though the windows were shut. The voice began speaking longer sentences. Sometimes it mocked us, repeating what we said in distorted tones. Sometimes it threatened. One night, as my mother prayed by her bedside, the voice growled, "Your God can't save you." I tried convincing myself it was stress, a shared madness, something explainable, until the night I woke to see her. At the foot of my bed, the figure of a woman stood. Her dress was ragged, torn, her hair long and tangled. I could not see her eyes, only the pale stretch of her face. She didn't move, didn't sway like a shadow should. She just stared. When I blinked, she was gone. But the smell of damp earth lingered, as though she'd brought the grave into my room. The more I tried to ignore it, the bolder she became. My brother complained of scratches on his back, deep and angry, appearing overnight. My mother found her Bible thrown across the room, pages torn. My father, a man I had never seen afraid of anything, began sleeping with a gun under his pillow. But no weapon could stop her. One evening, the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't my name. It was a warning. "Leave, or I'll take you." I sat upright, staring into the darkness, unable to respond. And that's when the bed shook, violently, as though unseen hands had grabbed the frame and were shaking it with rage. My brother screamed from his room, and I heard my mother crying downstairs. I don't know how long it lasted. When the shaking stopped, the house felt different. Lighter, but only for a moment, because I knew she wasn't gone. She was watching, waiting, enjoying our fear. Eventually, people from town came to witness it for themselves. They left with pale faces and shaking hands, refusing to speak of what they saw. Some said she was the spirit of a wronged woman. Others believed she was a demon sent to destroy us. I didn't care what she was. I only knew she was real. We stayed in that house far too long, long enough to know the witch never left. Some nights I still dream of her, standing at the end of my bed, waiting for me to acknowledge her again. Would you have answered the knocking? Or would you have kept silent, even as the voice grew louder? Tell me in the comments what you think, the bell, which really was a ghost, a curse, or something worse. Story 3. They say walls can hold memories, but what if the walls themselves want you to join them? I spent one night in the Lemp mansion, and I still don't know if I ever really left. I'd heard the stories 1,000 times, how the Lemp family rose on beer and fell into a spiral of tragedy, one terrible end after another. In a town where everyone knows someone connected to those names, the mansion was a dare, and a dare I accepted. I told myself I wanted to feel brave, wanted a story to tell at parties. The truth is uglier. I wanted to see if the worst rumors were true. I wanted proof. Curiosity, as you know, will get you into more than trouble. The mansion looks like a postcard from the outside. Ornate brickwork, arched windows, a kind of grandeur that doesn't belong in ordinary neighborhoods. On the evening I went back for the overnight tour, the sky had that pale wash of late autumn. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves and old wood. Our group moved through room after room. A guide's voice explained dates and names, each tragedy catalogued like museum artifacts. It all felt performative at first, a macabre theater. I stayed quiet, pretending not to care, but I watched the corners the way you watch a street that used to be safe and suddenly feels watched. At first, it was small things. A cold draft in a room where the windows were shut tight. Soft taps from inside walls that stopped the moment I concentrated on them. The guide spoke about the Lemp son who couldn't bear the family fortune. People nodded solemnly and shifted their weight. I pretended I was listening, but my attention kept returning to a heavy mirror mounted above a fireplace. In its reflection, the chandelier's light looked wrong, stretched at the edges, like a film warped by heat. For a blink, I thought I saw movement behind me in that reflection. The suggestion of a man, shoulders heavy, standing farther back in the hallway than anyone was standing in real life. When I spun, there was only the group milling toward the door. It was easy to tell myself it was a trick of light. It was harder to explain the smell that clung to the room then. Metal and old roses. As the night deepened, the oddities stopped feeling like coincidences. We went room to room and the atmosphere grew thicker. In the bedroom where one of the Lemp men ended his life, the air sucked the heat right out of my skin. My voice felt small when I whispered something to the woman beside me, and she answered like she'd been pushed by some private alarm. Then came the first unmistakable sound. A step just behind me. Not a group of steps, just one deliberate, measured step. A presence on the stairs that wasn't reflected in faces or shoes. I turned and there was nobody, but the hair at the back of my neck prickled with attention the way a dog perks up to an impossible scent. Later, when the tour broke and most people left, I didn't. I made some excuse, wanted to take pictures, wanted a closer look. I told myself I'd catch up with friends outside. The mansion had emptied into silence. The chandeliers swung faintly from the vents, and the creaks of settling would sounded like a building exhaling. I wandered alone, the cabling of my phone screen suddenly too small to fill the dark. In the basement, where the house's breathing felt closest, a dampness clung to my jacket. I should have left. I didn't. That's when I felt watched, and watched doesn't capture it. It was as if I'd walked into a room with portraits whose eyes had been scrubbed clean, but the intent remained. I walked past the cellar rooms, past old trunks, past a doorway that had been secured once but now hung slightly ajar. In the doorway stood a man like a shadow with weight. He wasn't a silhouette that needed sunlight to form. He had a presence that crowded the air, broad-shouldered, tall, with a face I couldn't quite focus on. He didn't step forward. He didn't leave. He simply observed, and that observation made me suddenly unsure whether the house belonged to the past or wanted me in its future. I made a move to back away and the floor complained, a soft groan like a warning. When I glanced at the stairwell, the same figure appeared at the top of the steps in the reflection on a glass display case. Closer this time, like something creeping closer to the edge of a photograph. My mouth went dry. I tried to tell myself it was exhaustion, the city lights, the angle of the glass, but my breath kept catching on its own. I could feel the kind of pressure you only know when a room fills with people and every face is watching the same thing. The house grew bolder. Whispers rose up from between the rafters, quick and layered like a dozen old radios tuning into different frequencies. The whispers weren't words I could catch at first. They were cadence and intention, haunting rhythms that tightened my chest. Then one voice threaded through the chorus and said something clearly. My name. Not rude, not loud, just a soft pronunciation that made it personal. I remember thinking how absurd it was that a building could pronounce someone's name like a person. That thought came and went before I could answer it. When the entity made itself fully known, it did something physical. The chandelier above me flickered violently once, twice, then steadied but remained dimmer, as if it had been stripped of power. A cold draft pushed past me, and the scent of something like stale wine overwhelmed the basement's dampness. The man in the doorway shifted his shoulders in a gesture that felt like a knuckled warning. I reached for my phone and the screen died. The lightless rectangle in my hand mocked me. For a moment I thought the room had gone there to take my only source of daylight. I ran more from instinct than a clear plan. The stairs felt endless and the hallways longer than memory should allow. Behind me a sound rose. Footsteps, not my own, moving through rooms like someone pacing with measure. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold air of the street hitting me like a slap. My chest felt raw. My ears ringed with an aftertone like a bell tolling at the edge of hearing. People passed on the sidewalk, chatting, oblivious. I wanted to laugh, to tell them about the man who didn't exist, but the laugh turned to a small, frightened noise. Days after, the mansion didn't leave me. My mirror began returning a figure behind me in the corner of early mornings. Something that stood in the dark of the bedroom when the hallway light was off. I'd blink and it would be gone, but its pattern of presence, shoulder, tilt, hollowed eyes, was fixed. At night, my dreams carried narrow hallways and a man at the far end, waiting. Once, in the middle of a workday, I found a dust print on my kitchen counter. 2 footprints, faint, as if someone had stood there, watching me from the same angle as the limp man had watched. I cleaned the dust and the marks reappeared overnight, smaller, like the press of shoe soles from a past the world didn't want to release. I tried to tell myself I'd only provoked it by staying, that it wanted attention and I had given it more than it deserved. I sold the story to friends, smoothed the edges, made it a circus tale. But the man's outline in reflective surfaces never quite smoothed away. And when I drive past that direction in the city now, I pay attention to windows I once ignored. There are houses you pass casually for years until one night you stop and notice faces in their glass watching you back. Would you spend the night in the Lemp mansion? Would you go back after the initial scare because you wanted to prove something to yourself? Tell me in the comments if you think the Lemp house is haunted by the dead, or if it's the living who carry something that won't remain buried. Story 4. They said the Queen Mary was just a ship, but when I walked her halls, it felt like stepping into a graveyard at sea. I had always been fascinated by ocean liners, so when I traveled to California, visiting the retired Queen Mary in Long Beach was at the top of my list. People called her the most haunted ship in America, but I brushed that off as tourist bait. I was wrong. From the moment I stepped aboard, something felt heavy. The ship smelled of salt and rust, but beneath it was something else, something stale, like time itself had rotted. The guide told us stories of sailors crushed by watertight doors, passengers who never made it to their destinations, and children who drowned in the pool. Each tragedy felt like it lingered in the walls. I remember pausing by the infamous door 13, where a young sailor was crushed to death. As I stared, I heard the clang of metal, sharp and sudden, echoing down the hall. No one else reacted. When I asked if they'd heard it, the group looked at me blankly. My stomach sank. Later, in the pool area, I trailed behind the group. The room was cold, though California sun blazed outside. Tiles were cracked, water long drained. Yet I swore I heard splashing, soft, playful, like children swimming. Then came the laughter, high-pitched giggles bouncing off the walls. My chest tightened. I turned, and for a fleeting second, I saw a little girl in an old-fashioned bathing suit standing by the edge of the pool. She looked at me, smiled, and vanished. By the time the tour ended, my nerves were frayed. But my worst moment came as I made my way out. I passed through a long corridor, the kind where every footstep echoes. Only the footsteps didn't match mine. They followed, a beat behind, closer with each step. I stopped. They stopped. My mouth went dry. I forced myself to keep walking, heart racing, until I finally burst out into the open air. That night in my hotel, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw water rushing in, filling my lungs. The Queen Mary had followed me back. Would you dare sleep overnight on that ship? Or do you think some vessels should never dock, even in death? Story 5. They say Stephen King only needed one night here to imagine The Shining. I lasted 2, and I'm still not sure if the nightmares ever stopped. When I booked a weekend stay at the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, I thought it would just be a thrill, a way to walk through horror history. After all, it's famous as the inspiration for The Shining, the place where King himself dreamt of a boy chased by a fire hose that came alive. But what they don't tell you is that the hotel doesn't just inspire fear. It breathes it. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was the silence. For such a grand building, perched against the Rockies with its blinding white walls and red roof, I expected the sound of laughter, chatter, life. But when I stepped into the lobby, it felt muted, as though the air itself swallowed sound. My footsteps seemed too loud, each one an intrusion. The front desk clerk smiled politely, but there was something in her eyes, something almost apologetic, like she knew I wouldn't be sleeping much. "Room 217, she said, sliding the key across the counter. My stomach dropped. That was the room where King himself stayed. I laughed nervously, but she didn't laugh back. Walking the hallway to 217 felt like marching down a tunnel. The carpet stretched endlessly, the lights flickering just enough to make me wonder if it was intentional. When I unlocked the door, the room itself looked ordinary. Victorian furniture, heavy curtains, the faint smell of lavender. But I felt watched from the moment I crossed the threshold. That first night, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I sat on the bed, reading until I heard it. The faint sound of children running in the hall. Giggles, light footsteps. I smiled, relieved, other guests just kids. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty, silent. The air smelled faintly of old dust and something metallic, like blood. I shut the door quickly, but the moment I turned back to the bed, my suitcase was on the floor. I hadn't touched it. The latch was undone, clothes spilling out like someone had rummaged through them. My chest tightened. I locked the door, crawled under the covers, and tried to sleep. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to a crushing weight on my chest. My eyes shot open, but I couldn't move. The room was ice cold, my breath fogging the air. And then I saw her. A woman in a long dress, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She stood at the foot of the bed, watching me. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. When I finally managed to blink, she was gone, and the weight lifted. I gasped, sitting upright, drenched in sweat. But the worst part wasn't the vision. It was the faint indentation on the mattress, as if someone had been sitting right beside me. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I explored the grounds, listened to the staff stories, pretended I wasn't rattled. But that night, things escalated. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom when the lights flickered. The mirror fogged, though no hot water was running. Slowly, words began to form in the condensation. "Get out." My toothbrush clattered into the sink. I bolted into the bedroom, but the door slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed, louder than it should have been. And then came the piano. Soft, haunting notes drifting through the floorboards. I froze. There was no one in the lobby playing that late. I knew that much. The music grew louder, the same notes again and again, until it sounded less like a melody and more like a warning. I didn't sleep that second night. I lay awake, every creak of the old building making me jump. Around 3 a.m., the temperature dropped again. My breath hung in the air, my skin prickling with goosebumps. And then, from the corner of the room, came a sound I'll never forget. The slow, deliberate click of heels across the floor. I turned my head, heart hammering, and saw her again. The same woman, closer this time, her head tilted, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak. But instead of words, a low moan filled the room. I shut my eyes, whispered prayers, and when I opened them again, the room was empty. But I couldn't ignore the faint scent of roses that lingered, cloying and unnatural. By morning, I was done. I packed my things in a frenzy and checked out without breakfast. The clerk didn't even look surprised. She just nodded, as if she had seen this play out countless times. It's been years since that stay, but even now, I dream of that woman. Sometimes she's at the foot of my bed. Sometimes she's in the corner of the room, always watching, always waiting. Would you dare sleep in room 217? Or do you think some doors are better left unopened? Story 6. They call it a floating hotel now, but don't let the glossy brochures fool you. Once you step inside the Queen Mary, you're stepping into a graveyard at sea. I booked a night on the Queen Mary in Long Beach because I've always been drawn to places with history. The ship is majestic, a towering remnant of a time when ocean liners ruled the seas. It once carried celebrities, soldiers, even royalty. But beneath all that glamour is something much darker. Something that seeps out of every corridor and cabin, reminding you that thousands of lives have touched, and sometimes ended, within those steel walls. From the outside, the ship glows with nostalgia. String lights line the decks, and the polished wood gleams. But the moment I stepped aboard, my chest tightened. It wasn't seasickness. The air felt heavier, damp, almost thick with memory. The woman at the check-in desk smiled politely, but her words didn't put me at ease. "You're on B deck," she said. "Cabin B340. She hesitated before handing me the key. "You might hear things at night. Don't worry, it's just part of the experience." I'd already heard of B340. People say it's the most haunted cabin on the entire ship, so disturbing that it was closed for decades. I laughed nervously and told myself that's why I booked it. The skeptic in me wanted a story to tell. The problem is, I got more than I bargained for. The cabin was small, barely larger than a closet. A bed, a desk, a tiny bathroom. It smelled faintly of salt and something musty, like old wood. I dropped my bag on the bed and heard a knock on the wall. I froze. There was no cabin next to mine on that side. It was a sealed-off section of the ship. I brushed it off, told myself it was the pipes, and went to dinner. When I returned later that evening, the lights in my cabin were off, though I'd left them on. My key card still worked, so I went inside. The air was icy. I could see my breath, and the smell of salt was stronger, almost choking. I turned on the light and saw the bedspread was pulled back, as though someone had been lying there. My bag was on the floor, unzipped. I tried to rationalize it, but the night was only just beginning. Around midnight, I lay in bed, the ship creaking around me, when I heard the first sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth just outside my door. I held my breath. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the door. I whispered, "Who's there?" But there was no reply. I opened the door quickly, hoping to catch someone in the act. But the hallway was empty, stretching silent and endless. When I closed the door, I nearly screamed. On the desk, written in condensation as though traced by an invisible finger, were the words, "Get out." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, something jolted me awake. A whisper in my ear, the sound of running water in the bathroom, the sudden creak of the wardrobe door opening on its own. At one point, I looked up and saw the bathroom light flicker. The faucet turned on by itself. I walked over to shut it off, and in the mirror, I saw him. A man, standing directly behind me, his eyes dark, his face twisted with anger. He wore what looked like a Navy uniform, and his mouth was moving, but I couldn't hear the words. I spun around. No one was there. When I turned back to the mirror, the words, "Help me," were scrawled across the foggy glass. By then, I was trembling. I left the bathroom door open, needing to keep it in sight. I sat on the bed, clutching the blanket like a shield, when the temperature plummeted again. The blanket was yanked downward, hard, as though someone had grabbed it. I pulled it back, but it tugged again. This time I let go. The blanket slid off the bed, pooling on the floor. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then I heard it, a child's laugh. High-pitched, playful, but horribly out of place. The sound grew louder, echoing around the cabin, until it was coming from every corner. My skin prickled as the laughter turned into crying. A boy's voice whispered, "Why won't you play with me?" I jumped up, unlocked the door, and bolted into the hallway. But the hallway wasn't empty. At the far end, a shadowy figure stood, still as stone, the shape of a man. He started walking toward me, his footsteps echoing on the steel floor. I stumbled backward, fumbling for the key, and slammed the cabin door shut again. I leaned against it, gasping until the knocking started again. Harder this time, more frantic. The door rattled on its hinges, and then silence. I didn't sleep a minute. I sat upright, the lights on, waiting for daylight. At dawn, I grabbed my bag and went straight to the lobby. The staff didn't ask why I was checking out early. They just looked at me knowingly. One of them said, almost casually, "Did the little girl visit you? Or was it the angry sailor?" That was all the confirmation I needed. Now, whenever I see the ocean, I think of that night on the Queen Mary. Sometimes I hear the knock in my dreams. Sometimes I see that man in the mirror. And sometimes I wonder, if the ship ever sets sail again, how many spirits will go with it? Would you spend the night in cabin B340? Or do you think some places aren't meant to be disturbed? Story 7. They say evil leaves a stain that never fades. I didn't believe that until I spent one night inside the Amityville house. I never thought I'd step foot inside the infamous house on Ocean Avenue. Growing up, I heard the stories whispered like a warning. The murders, the family that fled after only 28 days, the books, the movies. To me, it was just another ghost story people exaggerated. But when a friend told me he had a connection who could get us inside for one night, my curiosity outweighed my caution. I wanted to see for myself if it was all a myth. We drove to Long Island at dusk, the streets lined with bare trees that rattled in the cold wind. When the house came into view, it almost fooled me. White siding, neat lawn, black shutters, and those quarter-moon windows staring like eyes at the street. It looked ordinary, maybe even cozy, but there was something off. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt the weight of it pressing down on me. It wasn't just a house. It was a wound. Inside, the air was thick and stale. Every breath felt heavier than it should. The living room looked like any other suburban home. Couches, framed pictures, a fireplace, but it all felt staged, like a set waiting for actors to step on stage. The silence made me uneasy. My friend cracked a joke, but his voice sounded strange, like it didn't belong in the space. We brought our sleeping bags upstairs to what had once been the children's bedroom. The wooden steps groaned beneath our weight, and I couldn't stop picturing Ronald DeFeo climbing those same stairs with a rifle, moving from room to room while his family lay sleeping. I shook the thought away, but it lingered. The bedroom was colder than the rest of the house. The air bit at my skin, sharp and unnatural. I spread out my sleeping bag by the wall, trying not to think about the history of that room. My friend sat up across from me, muttering about how this was just another overhyped haunted house. His confidence made me laugh, but it didn't settle my nerves. Around 11 p.m., the shift began. It started with the floorboards, faint creaks that didn't match our movements. Then came the knocking, slow, steady, from somewhere below us. We froze, listening as the sound grew louder, moving up the staircase one step at a time. We held our breaths. Nothing followed. The house went still again. We tried to shrug it off, convincing ourselves it was the wood settling. But then the smell hit, acrid, sour, like sulfur and rotting eggs. It filled the room so fast we both gagged, covering our mouths. My eyes watered as the odor thickened. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, a voice broke through the dark. Deep, guttural, nothing human. It came from the far corner of the room, low and forceful, like a growl shaped into words I couldn't understand. My friend grabbed his flashlight, but the beam didn't cut the dark. It bent strangely, swallowed up before it reached the corner. He swore under his breath and shut it off, as if leaving it off was safer. The voice continued, growing louder, echoing inside my skull until it felt like it was vibrating in my bones. Then it stopped. The door slammed shut so hard the walls shook. We jumped to our feet, but the knob wouldn't turn. My friend pulled with both hands, his shoulders straining, but it didn't budge. Then, from the hallway came the sound of running feet. Not heavy adult footsteps, light, quick, like children. Laughter followed. High-pitched, gleeful, but wrong. The sound circled the room, bouncing around us until I couldn't tell where it was coming from. A small handprint appeared on the window, pressed from the inside. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my bag. My friend shouted, throwing his weight against the door, desperate to get out. That's when the shadows began to shift. At first, it was just movement, like smoke curling in the air. But slowly, a shape formed. A tall figure, darker than the room itself, with shoulders too broad and limbs too long. Its eyes glowed faintly red, like embers. My throat closed up. I couldn't scream, couldn't breathe. The figure leaned forward, and the voice returned, louder now, filling every inch of space. My ears rang with it. I wanted to cover them, but my arms wouldn't move. The flashlight flickered back on by itself, casting a weak glow across the room. For a second, I thought it would reveal nothing and I'd be relieved. But it caught the figure just enough to show its outline. It wasn't smoke anymore. It had shape, mass, and it was standing between us and the door. Then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The voice cut off. The figure vanished. The smell cleared. The door creaked open on its own. We stood frozen, waiting for another trick, but the silence held. Without a word, we grabbed nothing, not even our bags. We bolted down the stairs, tripping over each other in our rush to get out. Outside, the night air hit like salvation. Cold, clean, alive. We collapsed on the lawn, gasping, staring up at the house as if expecting it to lunge after us. The windows stared back, blank and lifeless. My friend whispered, "Never again." His voice shook. I didn't answer. Couldn't. We left everything behind. Sleeping bags, clothes, even the flashlight. None of it mattered. As we drove away, the house shrank in the distance, but the weight of it didn't lift. I felt it trailing us, like a stain clinging to my skin. I still wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed. Would we have made it out alive? Or would we have joined the others whose voices still echo in that house, trapped in its walls forever? If someone gave you the key to the Amityville house, would you step inside? Or would you stay as far away as possible from a place where evil never left? Story 8. They say the dead never really leave Gettysburg. If you ever hear boots crunching on gravel when no one is there, or a drum beating faintly in the distance, don't follow the sound. I once did, and I swear what I saw that night will never let me rest again. It started as one of those road trips I thought would be relaxing. I had been driving through Pennsylvania in early autumn, chasing the kind of quiet landscapes that made me feel small but safe. The leaves were a mixture of gold and deep red, and the air had that crisp bite that hinted winter was near. Gettysburg was on my route mostly by accident. I had read about the battle in school, about how it was one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history, but history books never really prepared me for standing in a place like that. It didn't feel like a tourist site when I pulled over and walked into the fields. It felt heavy and lonely, as if time itself had slowed down just for that patch of earth. That evening, I checked into a small inn nearby. The owner was polite but spoke in hushed tones, warning me not to wander too close to the fields after dark. I thought it was just one of those local superstitions meant to keep people respectful. After all, every old town seemed to have ghost stories. I smiled, nodded, and told myself I was only there to admire the quiet countryside. But curiosity has a way of dragging you where you shouldn't go. Later that night, after dinner, I stepped outside. The sky was cloudless and the moon lit the fields in a pale silver glow. I wanted to take a short walk before heading to bed. The path toward the old battlefield stretched wide and inviting, so I followed it without much thought. first, everything was peaceful. I could hear crickets and the occasional owl. My shoes brushed against fallen leaves, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke from chimneys in town. That's when I noticed the first odd thing. The crickets suddenly quieted, all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence wasn't normal. It was too sudden. Then, faintly, I heard what sounded like boots hitting gravel. Slow, deliberate footsteps that didn't match my own. I stopped walking and turned around, expecting to see another visitor, maybe a reenactor out late. No one was there. The path was empty in both directions. I told myself it was probably just my imagination or maybe an animal moving somewhere in the brush. But when I resumed walking, the sound returned. Boots, steady, pacing behind me. I turned quickly this time, but again, there was no one. The moonlight should have made it easy to see anyone approaching. The path stretched far and clear, but I was alone. I quickened my pace, but the steps grew louder, closer, until I could almost picture someone marching just a few feet behind me. I stopped again, heart pounding faster, and listened. The sound faded into nothing, leaving only the faint whistle of wind across the field. I was ready to turn back when another sound drifted through the air. Faint, rhythmic drumming, like the distant beat of a war drum. It was too slow and steady to be anything modern, and it seemed to come from the open field to my right. I scanned the tall grass, half expecting to see someone holding an old drum. Nothing, just empty moonlit fields stretching far into the distance. Something inside me whispered that I should leave, but something else pulled me forward. I stepped off the path and walked into the field, my shoes crunching against the dry grass. The drumming grew clearer, louder, until I could almost feel it vibrating in the ground beneath my feet. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. That's when I saw them. Figures, faint and gray, moving slowly across the field. At first I thought it was smoke, twisting and curling into human shapes, but the more I stared, the more defined they became. Dozens of men in ragged uniforms, marching silently, their faces pale and hollow, eyes fixed forward as if I wasn't even there. Some carried rifles, others dragged themselves along as if wounded, their movements jerky and uneven. My throat went dry as I realized I was standing in the middle of a ghostly procession. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The soldiers passed me, one after another, their forms flickering in and out like broken film. The air grew colder as they moved around me. One of them turned his head suddenly and looked right at me. His eyes were dark, bottomless, and though his lips never moved, I heard a whisper inside my head. Lost. That single word echoed in my mind. Too sharp, too real. I staggered back, finally finding the strength to move. But as I did, the figures began to vanish into the night one by one, dissolving back into mist. The field grew still again, empty, as if nothing had ever happened. But the smell of gunpowder lingered faintly in the air, mixed with something metallic and sour, like blood. I stumbled back onto the path, shaking, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe my brain playing tricks. But then I heard it again, the boots. This time they came from directly behind me, close enough that I swore I would feel a hand on my shoulder any second. I ran. I didn't care about the path. I just sprinted back toward the inn, lungs burning, heart racing. The footsteps chased me until I reached the porch of the inn, and then they stopped as if cut off by an invisible line. When I collapsed inside, the innkeeper was waiting, as if she had known. She didn't ask what happened, just looked at me with tired eyes and said, "You heard them, didn't you?" I couldn't even answer. She only nodded, as if my silence told her everything. "They're still marching," she whispered. "They've been marching for over 100 years, and they won't stop until someone listens." That night I didn't sleep. I kept hearing faint drumming outside my window, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the soldiers' dark, empty stare. The next morning, I left Gettysburg without looking back. But sometimes, even now, when the house is quiet and the night is still, I swear I hear boots pacing slowly across the floorboards, waiting for me to follow them again. Would you have kept walking into that field? Or would you have turned back the moment you heard the footsteps? Tell me what you think, because even now, I can't decide if it was curiosity that almost destroyed me, or something in that battlefield calling me by name. Story 9. If you ever check into a hotel and the mirror in your room doesn't show your reflection right away, leave. I didn't, and what I saw in that delay has followed me long after I checked out of the Crescent Hotel. I had been on the road for weeks, traveling through the Ozarks, when I decided to stop for a night in Eureka Springs. The town looked like something out of a storybook. Winding streets, stone buildings, and the towering Crescent Hotel perched on a hill, watching everything below it. I'd heard rumors about its history, that it had once been a hospital run by a quack doctor who promised miracle cancer cures, but instead filled the place with pain and death. People called it America's most haunted hotel, but to me, that only made it more interesting. I was tired of faceless motels. I wanted character, even if it came with ghost stories. Walking through the grand lobby felt like stepping back in time. The ceilings were high, the chandeliers dim, and the walls seemed to lean in as if listening. Guests milled about, some whispering, some laughing nervously. I checked in and got room 218, one of the rooms the desk clerk mentioned with a strange little smile. He didn't explain why, but I noticed his eyes flicker, just for a moment, as if weighing whether to say more. That evening, after a long dinner, I went back to my room. At first, it was just like any other. 4 walls, a bed, a dresser. The wallpaper was peeling slightly at the edges, and the light flickered once before settling. I unpacked a few things, set my phone on the nightstand, and decided to wash up. That's when I noticed the mirror. It stood tall above the dresser, the glass old and warped. When I walked past it, I should have seen myself immediately, but there was a delay, just half a second, where the glass stayed dark before my reflection appeared. I blinked, leaned closer, and tried again. Same thing. For a heartbeat, there was nothing, and then my image slid into place as if it had been late arriving. I told myself it was just the age of the glass, but unease lingered. I left the mirror alone and climbed into bed with the fan humming softly. Sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I heard faint knocking, 3 sharp taps, from the inside of the bathroom. I sat up, listening. The room was quiet except for the steady hum of the fan. Then came the knock again, a little louder. I got up and pushed the bathroom door open. Empty. The faucet dripped once, echoing against the tile, but there was no one inside. When I returned to bed, I noticed something strange. The mirror seemed brighter, almost glowing faintly in the dark, though no light should have been hitting it. I pulled the covers tighter and turned away, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But sleep never fully came. Every time I drifted, I felt watched, as though someone was standing by the bed. At some point, I woke to a sound that turned my blood cold. It was laughter, soft, high-pitched, like a child. I sat up quickly, scanning the room. Nothing. The mirror, though, looked different. My reflection was there, but it wasn't moving the way I was. I lifted my hand slowly. The reflection lagged behind. It smiled when I wasn't smiling. I stumbled back, knocking into the nightstand. My phone clattered to the floor. When I looked up again, the reflection had caught up, but the smile remained, frozen, stretching wider than my face could manage. I turned the mirror toward the wall, desperate not to see it anymore. The rest of the night dragged on in a blur of faint knocks, whispers, and shadows flickering across the ceiling. At one point, I swear the mattress dipped as if someone sat at the edge of the bed, though I couldn't bring myself to look. By dawn, my nerves were frayed, but I was alive, and that felt like enough. I packed quickly, relieved to see daylight spilling through the curtains. As I lifted my suitcase, I noticed the mirror again, even though I had turned it to face the wall. Somehow it was upright, facing me, and there, in the glass, was my reflection. But behind it stood a figure, tall, thin, dressed in white, watching me with hollow eyes. I spun around. The room was empty. I slammed the suitcase shut and rushed out the door without looking back. At the front desk, I tried to keep my voice steady as I handed in the key. The clerk only nodded, as if he'd been expecting this reaction. Room 218, he said softly. She doesn't like being ignored. Driving away from the Crescent Hotel, I kept checking the rearview mirror. Every time I blinked, I half expected to see that tall figure sitting in the back seat, waiting to follow me home. Would you have stayed in that room all night, or would you have left the moment the mirror lagged? Tell me, because even now, I wonder if leaving when I did was already too late. Story 10. If you ever hear footsteps echoing down a long hallway, but you're the only one inside, don't follow them. I did, and that's why I'll never go back to Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Started as a dare. A few friends and I were driving through Kentucky when one of them brought up Waverly Hills, the infamous tuberculosis hospital where thousands had died. The place had been abandoned for decades, and ghost tours ran at night for people brave enough to walk its halls. I wasn't someone who believed easily in hauntings, but the idea of spending a night in a building with such a history intrigued me. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The building was enormous, looming against the night sky like a stone skeleton. Its windows were dark, its walls streaked with age, and vines crept up the sides like veins. At the entrance, our guide gave us a few warnings. Don't wander off alone, don't taunt the spirits, and if you hear someone calling your name, don't answer. I laughed nervously, but part of me couldn't shake the chill those words carried. Inside, the air was thick with dust and age. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on peeling paint, rusted bed frames, and long-forgotten wheelchairs. The halls stretched endlessly, lined with doors that led into small, suffocating patient rooms. Each creak of the floorboards seemed to echo for miles. My friends whispered and giggled at first, but soon even they fell quiet. The place demanded silence, as if listening. We reached the 5th floor, which the guide said was notorious. He told us that room 502 had seen more tragedy than most. Stories of a nurse who hanged herself, another who leapt to her death. People claimed the room was cursed, that anyone who stayed too long inside would feel an overwhelming urge to die. The guide left us there, saying he'd return after a while, giving us time to explore. We stepped into the hallway outside 502, and almost immediately, I felt different. The air was colder, heavier, as if pressing down on my chest. My friends dared each other to peek inside, but no one wanted to go first. Eventually, I pushed the door open. The room was small, empty except for a broken sink and graffiti scrawled across the walls. My flashlight caught the ceiling, and I noticed a dark stain spreading outward, the kind of mark that never truly fades. That's when I heard it. A soft, dragging sound, like feet shuffling across the floor. It came from down the hallway, past the beam of my light. I whispered for my friends, but they were silent. The sound grew louder, closer, as if someone was slowly approaching. I leaned into the hall, my flashlight shaking in my hand. First, I saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of the beam, a figure appeared. Tall, thin, dressed in what looked like hospital clothing. It was walking slowly, deliberately, but its face was hidden in shadow. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to call out, but something inside me screamed not to. The figure stopped, tilting its head slightly, as if studying me. Then it turned and slipped into one of the side rooms. Against all reason, I followed. I told myself it had to be someone from the tour, maybe even the guide trying to scare us. But when I entered the room, it was empty. No windows, no doors but the one I had just used, and no one inside. A sudden crash echoed from behind me, metal striking metal. I spun around, heart hammering, but the hall was deserted. My friends were nowhere to be seen. I called their names, my voice bouncing down the corridor, but there was no reply. Instead, I heard whispers, dozens of them all around me, overlapping, too low to understand but unmistakably human. The flashlight flickered, plunging me into darkness before flaring back to life. For a split second, the hall was filled with figures. Patients in gowns, nurses with hollow eyes, shadowy shapes standing in every doorway. And then they were gone. Panic surged through me. I ran, my footsteps thundering on the floor. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, each door the same, each turn leading nowhere. The whispers followed, louder now, urgent, as if they wanted me to stop, to listen. Ahead, I saw light spilling from a doorway. I rushed toward it, desperate, and stumbled into what looked like the infamous body chute, the tunnel where they had once carried the dead out of the hospital. The chute sloped steeply downward, its walls damp and crumbling. My flashlight beam barely reached the bottom. As I stood there, trying to decide whether to climb down or turn back, I heard footsteps above me, dozens of them, stomping in unison, like a stampede. The air grew colder, and the whispers turned to screams. I shone my light upward and froze. The figure from before stood at the top of the chute, staring down at me. This time I saw its face. Sunken cheeks, hollow sockets where eyes should have been, its mouth stretched impossibly wide in a silent scream. I bolted, scrambling up the incline, not daring to look back. I burst into the open hallway just as the guide appeared, calling my name. My friends stood behind him, pale and shaken. They swore they hadn't seen me leave the group. To them, I had vanished the moment we entered the 5th floor, gone for nearly 20 minutes. We left Waverly Hills not long after. I didn't speak much during the ride back, but I couldn't stop glancing into the dark windows of the building as it faded behind us. Even now, I can still hear those footsteps when the house is quiet, still see that hollow face watching me from the top of the stairs. Would you have walked into that hallway alone? Or would you have turned back the moment you heard the dragging footsteps? Tell me what you think, because I don't know if following that figure was my biggest mistake, or if ignoring it would have been worse.